All right, let's jump right in. We hear the term mass incarceration all the time, right? But what if the system we see isn't actually broken? What if it's working exactly as it was designed? Today, we're going to dig into an economic and political explanation for why the US locks up more of its people than any other industrial nation on Earth. And let's start with a number that should stop you in your tracks: 1 in 3. Just let that sink in. According to the source material for this explainer, that is the number of Black men in America who can expect to go to jail in their lifetime. Now, the argument is this isn't some historical accident, and it's not just a simple story of crime and punishment. It's the direct result of very specific economic interests and political choices. So the big question is, how on earth did we get here? To get to the bottom of that, here's our game plan. First, we're going to look at the core economic theory. Then, we'll see how that plays out on the streets. After that, we'll follow the money into the prison business, look at the very real human impact, and finally, try to understand how this whole system keeps itself going.
So, first up, a tale of two economies. The material we're looking at today argues that if you really want to understand mass incarceration, you have to start with the economy.
It all centers on this concept of a dual economy. So picture society split into two totally separate worlds. On one side, you have the high-wage FTE sector. That's your finance, your tech, your electronics. And on the other side, you've got this huge low-wage sector. The relationship between these two, well, that's the whole story. And as you can see here, their interests are completely at odds. According to this theory, the wealthy FTE sector's success depends on keeping wages down for everybody else. But, how do you manage a huge population like that, especially one that's disproportionately made up of minorities? Well, you support policies of social control. And this helps the FTE sector get its other big prize, lowering its own taxes by gutting social programs. So here's the kicker. From this point of view, mass incarceration isn't really about crime at all. It's a powerful tool for hitting all these economic targets. It keeps wages low, it justifies harsh policies using what the source calls racecraft, that's using racial arguments to cover up economic motives, and it paves the way to privatize public services by first making sure they fail from lack of funding.
Okay, so that's the theory. But what does it actually look like on the ground, in our neighborhoods? Well, that brings us right to our next section, policing as warfare.
It really starts with the gear. The source points out that the Pentagon literally gives local police departments its surplus military equipment. We're talking about hardware designed for battlefields overseas. And that just fundamentally changes the whole dynamic, doesn't it? It shifts from community policing to something that feels a lot more like a military occupation. And we saw a really stark example of this back in Ferguson, Missouri in 2014. After Michael Brown was killed, people in the community came out to protest. And what did the police show up in? Not just riot gear. They rolled up in a fortified military-grade armored vehicle. That sends a pretty clear message, right? This isn't about keeping the peace. This looks like war. And the escalation didn't stop. In 2016, police in Dallas used a bomb disposal robot to deliver and detonate an explosive to kill a suspect. I mean, even law enforcement officials had to admit that this tactic blurred the line between policing and warfare. The goal of war is to kill the enemy. The goal of policing is supposed to be something very, very different. Now look, this didn't happen overnight. This was built piece by piece over decades of tough-on-crime politics. The source traces it from the Rockefeller drug laws in the 70s, through the Just Say No moral panic of the 80s, all the way to the massive 1994 crime bill, which just poured billions of dollars into building more prisons and hiring more police. All this expansion, all this government spending, it created a brand new market. And that brings us to our third part, the business of incarceration. Because you know the saying, where there's government money, private companies are sure to follow. The source has a great term for this, the private-public oxymoron. And the playbook is pretty simple. Step 1, you cut funding for a public service, like a prison system. Step 2, you watch it struggle and decline in quality. Step 3, you declare it a failure and make the argument that the private sector could do it so much better. And just like that, the door is open to privatization. A key player in this whole process, according to the source, is a group called ALEC. That's the American Legislative Exchange Council. Think of it as a club where corporations and state politicians get together to write laws. And guess which corporations are some of their most influential members? You guessed it, private prison companies. So here's how that influence actually works. ALEC helps create model bills, which are basically just templates for laws. They've pushed hard for things you've definitely heard of, like three strikes laws and mandatory minimum sentencing. And what do those laws do? They send way more people to prison for way longer. The results? A booming market and huge profits for the very same private prison companies that helped write the playbook. But of course, this isn't just about corporate profits. The real price is paid in tax dollars and in human lives, which brings us to the staggering human cost. Let's start with the money. Every single year, states spend a mind-blowing $50 billion just to run their prisons. Now, to put that into perspective, they spend about $75 billion on higher education. So think about that. Our investment in locking people up is in the same league as our investment in educating them. And this human cost is not shared equally, not even close. While Black Americans make up about 15% of the U.S. population, they account for 40% of the people in prison. That level of disproportionality is it's impossible to ignore. The source really brings this home with the tragic story of one man, Isaiah Calaboo. He was someone with severe mental health issues who got caught in the revolving door of the justice system before he committed a terrible crime. The estimated lifetime cost to keep him incarcerated is over $3 million. Just think what a tiny fraction of that money could have done in preventative treatment. And the damage just radiates outward. As former Attorney General Loretta Lynch said, when we lock up a woman, we're often locking up an entire family. It destabilizes homes, it fractures communities, and it passes that trauma down from one generation to the next. All of this leads us to our final section, a system built to last. The source argues that this isn't some leaky pipeline that needs a few patches. No, this is a closed loop, a system designed to keep people in. So here's how that trap works. Once someone is released, they face huge barriers. They can't get a job, they can't get housing. On top of all that, they're slammed with what's called legal financial obligations, a mountain of fines and fees. If you can't pay that debt, which is almost impossible without a job, you can be sent right back to prison. It creates what the source calls a two-tiered system of punishment, one for the rich and a much harsher one for the poor. When you boil it all down, the argument presented in our source material lands on this one powerful idea, that incarceration in the U.S. is used to keep the poor quiet, while the safety nets that used to help them are dismantled. It's not a bug in the system, it's the main feature. And that leaves us with one last really challenging question. If we accept this premise for a second, that this is a system that's actually functioning exactly as it's intended to maintain this dual economy, then what does it even mean to reform it? How do you fix something that, by its own internal logic, isn't broken at all? That's the challenge this explanation leaves us to think about.